It felt like getting stabbed with a hot skewer behind my left pinky toe, but thankfully it was only a scorpion, and luckily it wasn't lethal. The dude looked like Luke Skywalker, but his name was Bo, and he surfed sort of like a sedated meerkat, kind of like that. The wood floor of the restaurant was so smooth that if you took off your sandals to feel it with your feet, it was like an existential experience. I sat on this yoga platform that hung perilously over this massive rocky cliff. They were the best waves of my life. The truck almost didn't make it up this muddy hill, even in four-wheel drive. The lens cap was left on all night in the time-lapse lightning photo session. We raced up the beach in this boat at full speed like Miami Vice. The chef made ranch from scratch. We never learned their names. Laughing hysterically while walking up an incredibly steep hill after a massive meal can almost make you pass out. If I throw all that at you and I go, isn't that a great story? You're like, no, that's not a story. It's like a stream of consciousness, gibberish. But if I say, I went on a surf trip to Nicaragua last week, you're like, oh, okay, all right. That makes sense. How many of you feel like sometimes your life is a series of fragments or incoherent bits and pieces, seemingly no particular meaning or significance, and sometimes it feels like you're trying to hold them together, and other times it feels like you sort of wake up in the middle of it and you're not sure what is holding it together? For thousands of years, ancient cultures have been telling stories around fires to help them make meaning, like a glue to hold their lives together, to give meaning and order and coherence. And so if you were to visit from another place and observe this past couple weeks around our tribal fire, Facebook, and you were to ask, who are these people and what are they doing here? You would pretty quickly arrive at the conclusion that we exist to argue about flags and sports. That's like the big story. And if other worldly visitors were to ask modern Western Christians what their story is, or even modern Western atheists what the Christian story is, what might they get? Now this is, I want feedback. What's the overarching Christian story? Who are we and why are we here? What are we doing here? I'm not going to break us into groups right now, but thoughts. What's the big picture story? Who are we? What are we doing here? Good, excellent. I feel like I'm honestly really glad you all are here. I feel like I can't fail here. No one knows what they're doing here. Welcome, me either. Bill.
To bear the beams of God's love and transmit them.
Okay, to bear the beams of God's love and transmit them. All right, beautiful. Anybody want to take a crack? Dan?
I think to look at Christ's life and question your own.
Ooh, self-reflection. Look at Christ's life and question your own. I like it. Anybody else? Big story. Who are we and what are we doing here? Serve others. Let's hope so. That would help, I think, a little bit. Any other thoughts? There's no wrong answers. I mean, obviously, I think it wrong. I'm going to say it, but Dave.
I think we're here because we're meeting a need.
Okay. You mean like here? Oh, okay. Here. Not existentially.
Existentially, we're here to meet a need to be together.
Okay.
Which you could take existentially too.
The big level. To be together. Okay.
Ordinary things trying to survive.
Okay. Ooh, I like that. We're ordinary people doing ordinary things, trying to survive. I don't care who you are. You've had that day. Yeah. I don't care what you believe either. You've had that day. Yeah.
To suffer and develop compassion from your suffering.
Yeah. To suffer and develop compassion. I like that. All right. Last one. Anybody? Okay. So, if you're visiting from somewhere else, you asked, what's this big story? You'd very likely get some version of this story. Most of us know this storyline implicitly, subconsciously, even though it was never maybe taught explicitly to us. We start on the left with absolute perfection in the Garden of Eden, and then there's this fall into original sin. Bum, ba, bum, bum. It's a bummer. Spoiler alert, though. Absolute perfection, the fall, and original sin actually never show up anywhere in the Bible. But we're not going to let that get in the way of a good story. The bottom of the trough, condemnation, that's where we live. Welcome. And this is also called the fallen world, human history, life on earth. Next comes an ascending line that's called salvation, redemption, justification, atonement. Sort of depends on your tradition, but that leads to the top right line known as heaven or eternity. And I know I've saved the best for last, eternal conscious torment, which is also not in the Bible, but it is apparently in hell. So we look at that and we go, wait, hold on. That's the story? That's the glue? That's the thing that holds everything together? So I want us to talk tonight about story in the context of these the series that we've started this fall, Reform, how the roots of tradition nurture innovation. And I want to admit that about half of this material is from Rob Bell, the other half I stole from Brian McLaren, and the third half is just collective secret sauce. So Caitlin did a really good job last week sort of starting us off in this series, and she set the stage. And by the way, the reason the room is like half full is I think we've got, I don't know how many, 30 parents and kids that are going rock climbing down at the rock climbing gym. Super cool, doing amazing work. So she set the stage for the story of change and innovation, that this is actually what is most true about the Christian faith. This is where it comes from, this is where it's going. And she talked about reform as a rummage sale. And this is an image she borrowed from Phyllis Tickle, cleaning out the garage, examining our stuff, which we do about every 500 years. And happy anniversary. October is the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation, which is why we're sort of thinking through this. What still needs reforming in our tradition, in the Christian faith? The problem is, we've done with this old story that exercise of pulling it out of the garage and examining it, but all we seem to do with it is tweak the existing lines. And so over time, we'll question hell, we'll specify salvation, we'll debate eternity, so we make this line longer and we make that one shorter, and this line gets a little bolder, but we never really questioned this entire framework itself. It's sort of rocked along for centuries as sort of the accepted Christian story. And there's way too much to cover tonight, but for the sake of simplicity and brevity, I want us to understand that this shape is actually not the shape of the story that Jesus understood, the Jewish story from which he emerges, but instead of the Greek philosophical narrative that Plato taught, which is the descent into Plato's cave of illusion, the emergence into enlightenment, philosophical enlightenment, as well as this sort of social political narrative of the Roman Empire. So you see the resemblance. You have the Platonic ideal being, fall into illusion, reality or becoming, the mess of life, and then salvation and back into this static ideal or down into the Greek Hades. And this Greco-Roman 6-line story may be familiar, but it is not the native narrative of the Hebrew Bible, nor of Jesus who emerges from that tradition. And so this isn't the roots of the Christian faith. It may have become a branch on the tree for a lot of generations, but it's not the roots. This isn't the core. So Abraham, Moses, Jeremiah, Jesus, Paul, James, none of them held this view. All the way up through the first 3 centuries of the church, this narrative couldn't be found. It was read backwards into the Christian faith. And the reason it's problematic is because this narrative creates a dualism that is not native to Christianity. It's not the root, it's not the DNA of this faith, because it creates this here, there, us, them, down, up, unenlightened, enlightened. This is the opposite of the Christian story of wholeness and oneness. And I want to argue tonight that the reform that we need is to reclaim a story of wholeness rather than dualism, of expansion rather than contraction. So the 6-line dualistic narrative leads to this tired old story. You may be familiar with this, maybe you're not. Our tribe is the best, our God is the best, our way is the best. Come join our tribe or we'll kick your ass, bless your heart. I'll pray for you. I think, and maybe again it's just me, I think we need a more expansive, more generous, gracious, loving story, one that's big enough to include the complexity and depth of the human experience, this world that we live in, one that's powerful enough to unite us, to call us together, rather than sorting us into warring tribes and sorting us into belief-based afterlife bins. So I want to offer 2 alternative narratives. The first, I'll do quickly because we don't have time to explain the whole Hebrew Bible. Let's call this progressive mythology. That's my language. So we said the 6-line narrative isn't actually in the Bible. It's read backwards from Plato. So the question is, what's the story? What's sort of the narrative arc of the Bible that's actually in there? And what we find is that it's creation, liberation, reconciliation. If you were to actually read the Bible on its own terms, this is sort of what you figure from the Hebrew Bible. Without getting into too much detail, and I tried to illustrate this in the readings, Jesus comes from the story in which The movement of God is understood as creation, liberation, and reconciliation. We see this through Genesis, Exodus, and then the prophets, this peaceful kingdom and justice. And I also paired this with New Testament readings, gospel readings, to show that this doesn't end with the end of the Hebrew Bible. This is actually the story that Jesus is telling and perpetuating. Now, not only is the 6-line narrative absent from the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, they create entirely different outcomes. So this sort of progressive mythology is one in which there is no here or there. There is only here. Again, because it's oneness. It's not dualism. Everything's happening where everything can happen. It's this one place. God is alive and at work in these worlds, in our lives. In the 6-line narrative, God is setting people free from life, right? And that's what that salvation thing is. Get up out of life to something better. In this progressive mythology of creation, liberation, and reconciliation here, God is setting people free for life. Freedom, justice, vibrancy, flourishing, here and now, not slaves, but fully human. This is sort of the story that's told. And in the 6-line narrative, good and bad are metrics for sorting people either into down or up, heaven or hell, reward or punishment. But in this other story, good and bad are simply understood as a part of the complexity of life. And so reconciliation becomes the name of the work of transforming bads into goods, working for justice, meeting hatred with love, meeting darkness with light. So to summarize, in the 6-line narrative, what we usually end up with is us versus them. And in a progressive mythology, what we end up with is some of us for all of us. This starts with the story of Abraham, a tribe that is for all the other tribes, an expanding consciousness of what it means to be human. It just seems to grow and grow and grow and include more people. There is no dualism, there is no binary. It's just a swelling movement of this creative, liberative, reconciling pursuit of the common good. Interestingly, when we hear the writers of the New Testament say things like, Jesus' life and death and resurrection are about the creation of a new humanity to set us free from sin and death, to reconcile all things, our impulse is to jam that back into the 6-line narrative and go, we know what that means. That's a transaction to get us saved out of here. That's a magic answer thing, when in actuality, it's a part of this much bigger story. Creation, liberation, reconciliation, this expansive consciousness of what it means to learn to be fully human in this world. Now, I don't know about you, but for me, this is good news. The reality that the roots of our tradition are not actually this binary, divisive, escapist story about being right or being better, about reward and punishment, about God hiding our happiness in a riddle. So we better get the belief right and the prayer right and the answer right, or else. At the same time, even if we take the story as far back as we can, the roots of the tradition, we find the creation stories aren't written until like the 5th or 6th century BC, after the Exodus, and even if we give the writers the benefit of the doubt and say they were telling the stories around campfires for a few thousand years before that, we still only get back close, if we stretch it, to like 10,000 years back. And I think if we're trying to root our tradition in an even bigger story, and the biblical writers do allude to this story, it has to begin first and foremost with humility. And so I want to offer this as a way of sort of grounding and humbling before we look at the next alternative narrative. There's a light year at the top there. There are many 100 billion stars in our galaxy, nearly all of them circled by at least one planet, about 1,500 light years out. Coming up on 100,000 light years out, the Milky Way galaxy, which our sun goes around every 200 million years. Andromeda, it's going to collide with the Milky Way in a few billion years, bummer. Other galaxies, as seen from the Hubble Deep Field images. $400 million light years out. is a supercluster of galaxies. The Milky Way is one of 100,000. A couple billion light years out. Cosmic web, billions and billions of galaxies. 20 billion light years out. Cosmic microwave background radiation afterglow of the Big Bang. This is our universe. Other universes? I love that it's a question. Different laws of nature? Marvel superheroes? No, that says the multiverse, sorry. It cuts off so quick you can't read the last question. It's very mysterious. I've tried to read it like 6 times. I don't know what it asks. So, does this perspective change how you understand the Christian story? And if so, how? I'm actually asking this. That wasn't the last question, by the way. That was not a Christian video.
It changes the linear story.
Okay, so it changes the linear story.
But it doesn't change what I believe.
Okay.
But it changes the linear story.
Okay, so maybe it pushes against that 6-line narrative. Jim?
Well, are we God's favorite people?
Yes.
I mean,
Next question. Yeah, do we, like, pride of place? Really? So God chose us.
Is Earth God's favorite planet?
Again.
Is the Milky Way God's favorite galaxy?
Yeah.
So on.
Favorite candy? We got to write this stuff down. We got stand up. Yeah.
Based on that, man came along in the last nanosecond.
Don't steal my sermon, Bill.
Just before midnight. And that means, what was God doing the whole 24 hours or billions of God knows what before? I mean, there's so much more to God than we can even have a clue about.
All right, I'm going to edit that out. Yeah, I was going to say that. Negligence, I assume. I don't know. Just figuring things out. What, anybody else? How does that change? How does it change? Yeah, Jerry.
It's hard for the human mind to wrap around that.
Yeah.
Just the numbers and the distance of the time. But rather than be, an entity that's distinct in the entire cosmos, that we're perhaps in the spectrum. We're part of a spectrum of progression of things.
All right, so rather than a fixed entity, we're a part of a spectrum or a progression of things. I could have paid you to say that. That was excellent.
Our understanding of the bigger things is, in a sense, correct for who we are.
Okay. Yeah, we can never, so our understanding is correct for who we are now. We can never do any better than our best to articulate our understanding of things, right? That's why a lot of us show up in this room every week, is we are trying to do our best to articulate who we are and why we're here. And we're trying to do better. Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. Yeah, we can't do better than our best. Like, we can work with what we got. Any other thoughts? Does it change? How does it? Yeah.
It makes me think that me on planet Earth is so small compared to the Milky Way and the whole universe.
Yeah.
It just makes me and my challenges, my life so small. It's really humbling.
Yep, and I think that's exactly why I wanted us to kind of pause there, because I think that humility is incredibly important. That sort of speck of dust suspended in a sunbeam, kind of, who are we, So I want us now to explore what I'm going to call the cosmic narrative. And I do want to clarify, this is actually not outside of the tradition. In fact, both the Old Testament writers and the Jesus stories, the writers actually ground the whole thing in this understanding that there is a bigger story. In the beginning, right? We heard this from Genesis. Since then, we've learned that it's been about 13.8 billion years, give or take. So we had a single point, there was a bang, and then 13.8 billion years of expansion, ongoing creation. In fact, Jim Kane was saying one of the most profound spiritual realizations he had was that this creation isn't something that happened past tense, but that is always happening right now, ongoing for 13.8 billion years. That all of that that's been happening, we're actually still experiencing that now, this becoming. How's that for an opening story? I mean, I think it's already maybe a little more captivating. Genesis says in the beginning when God was creating the heavens and the earth. The writer of John says in the beginning was the Word, this creative expression of God was with God, and essentially everything arises from this. And we might say, well, these are just poetic ways of connecting the name of God to evolution, to the progress of the universe. That's a poetic way of planting some of the roots of the Christ story in the cosmic soil of the universe. Yes. Yes, that is what the writers are doing. Exactly. And if you think religion is good at this, listen to some of these. This is what I'll call the poetry of science. They share sort of an in the beginning story called the Big Bang, a single point of infinite density containing all the compressed mass, space, time of the universe, a sextillion-ton pinprick of cataclysmic energy. That sounds like a lot of cataclysmic energy. I don't know how much that is, but it's a lot. An ineffable singularity of stupendous fecundity. Yeah, right? Because we're talking about science, not poetry, right? In the beginning. Single point, followed by 13.8 billion years, followed by some people sitting in a room asking, so what's the story really? Not just bits and fragments, but what's the glue? What's like the big thing that holds it together? First, there were particles. And if you're like, hold on, I need some more specifics here, fine. 13.8 billion years ago, 3 minutes in, to the life of the universe, particles bonded with other particles, and they created atoms. You may have heard of them. Then roughly 300,000 years later, the universe had cooled down to 6,000 degrees, which is the temperature of the sun, but the whole universe was that temperature. And I know you're thinking, check the thermostat. We're all kind of thirsty. So atoms bonded with other atoms, and they created molecules. And then about 400 million years later, we get stars. And then about 1 billion years later, we get planets, and then about 9 billion years in, we get the formation of our solar system, the sun, the planets. Fun fact, the sun gives off 400 million metric tons of energy every second to sustain the life of the universe. So what does self-giving love feel like? It's probably warm. It's a slow burn, but you'll like it. 10 billion years in, molecules bond with other molecules, they form cells, we get cellular life. And then a few billion years later, in the 13 billion year range, we start to get complex organisms, animals. There's that damn scorpion again. Then much later, in the 13 billionth year, we show up. And this is, thanks a lot, Bill, for teeing this up. To give you an idea, this is just what Bill said. The relationship between the age of the universe and our arrival in it, if you imagine just our solar system, not the entire universe, but just the formation of our solar system to the present as a 24-hour day. Human beings showed up in the last second, 11:59:59 of that cosmic day. We just got here. We just got here. Welcome. So if we take the fragmentary highlights from my surf trip last week, and we only have this sort of incoherent scattershot, if we only take the fragments from the last few days of my life, we miss the larger story. Right? Because the last second of a 24-hour day is not the whole day. If you ask Ben, what's your life story? And I give you these fragments from my trip, it would be incomplete. But even if I gave you this sort of highly detailed, eloquently written, coherent account of this magnificent surf trip, it still wouldn't be my life story. These fragments from my trip are not my whole life. And so when we offer a Christian narrative, a grand story from the perspective of the few thousand years of consciousness and reflection that we've got, when we string together these fragments of these few thousand years, less than a second into the cosmic day, we're in danger of this arrogance that you guys are naming that misses a bigger story, that inflates our sense of certainty and our sense of self-importance. Who are we among this entire universe? And so when we hold this narrative, this sort of oversimplified 6-line narrative, up against the video or up against this 13.8 billion year story, we sort of pause and go, really? Really? That's it? And I think we have this sort of innate sense, like this is a misguided reduction of a God in whom we live and move and have our being, a cosmic Christ, an all-encompassing Spirit in whom all that is. So when I say let's begin our call to reformation with humility, what I mean is that it sounds ridiculous enough to have been here as briefly as we have and to claim with such certainty and veracity that we've got it all figured out. We know what the story is. on top of which, ever since any of us has claimed with certainty to know what the story is, we haven't agreed about it, right? The whole time, we've just been fighting about it. On top of which, it feels sort of like this, like the Kramer bursting into the room and claiming to have the meaning of life. Like, let's take a breath. Let's just take a breath and admit that whatever this thing is, this is bigger than our understanding of whatever this thing is. And that humility and curiosity and wonder and unknowing, those are actually the roots of the tradition itself. And not like, take humility with a grain of salt, not that we're not impressive. We pull our Kramer, we sort of come on the scene, last minute, wide-eyed and wondrous, and we waste no time. We do fire and then tools and then language, and we get fantastically busy immediately. Clothes, agriculture, economics, ships, towns, cities, empires, iPhones, and the story sounds ridiculous, right? It's super weird. From a single point to planets, to plumbing, to pacemakers, to Planet Fitness. Which story is more ridiculous, right? When we sort of place them side by side. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Or in the beginning, a single point of something exploded, and 13.8 billion years later, I can FaceTime my kids from a remote cliff in Nicaragua and tuck them into bed before I go surfing in the middle of nowhere because there's a chunk of metal in the sky that transmits signals. Yeah, no, that makes total sense, right? That's not a crazy story at all. The deal is this. For a long time, the God story has been leveraged primarily as an exclusive story. This is how it happened. This is the only way to explain it. Who we are, where we come from, and it is read literally. And so any competing religious creation story and any competing secular scientific narrative, they're wrong, they're false, they're apostate, they're heretical. But in light of this cosmic story, I wonder if we might reframe the God story, so to speak, not as an exclusive story, but as an inclusive story. With enough room in that single sentence, in the beginning, God created. And in the following poetry, to find sort of a sacred dance between the myth that we love and the more we know about this unfolding cosmic story in which we find ourselves, because at the end of the day, there is only one story. It gets told in a lot of different ways, but there is only one story. And we know from the story of expansion that at the largest level that we can see and know and understand, it's all relationships of energy. All of it. But also at the quantum level, when we get as small as we can, subatomic particles, which, by the way, feel no obligation to obey the laws of physics, at the smallest core level, subatomic particles are also relationships of energy. From as small as we can get to as large as we can fathom, relationships of energy. I'm a pastor, so I deal with people's energy. How many of us have ever had a day or a season or a conversation where you left and you felt, God, I feel so drained. I feel so drained. Like, and maybe it's that particular person. You're picturing them right now, which is sort of rude, but it's understandable. What is that? It's relationships of energy. Like, that person sucks the life out of you. Meanwhile, I just got back from 3 days surfing, doing one of the things I love to do most in the world. We surf sometimes 6, 7, 8 hours a day. I was sore in places I have not been sore in decades. My neck and my shoulders were killing me. My right hand was like going numb. At the physical level, I was exhausted on par with having completed an Ironman triathlon. That's the only thing I could find to compare it to. I was just wrecked. And yet, at the end of the day, I was smiling and I was full of energy. Like, what? Relationships of energy. Now, Caitlin spoke last week about how reform is this pattern of the history of the church. It's always changing, it's always evolving, but about every 500 years, it has a major shakeup. It sort of expands things significantly. And that's the rule, not the exception. Reform is at the heart of who Jesus is, what Jesus does. We might say the church is a self-transcending reality. And she said it's always transcending and including what came before it, and we might think, how cool. How cool, how progressive, how innovative, how novel, but not really, because the church, like everything else, is planted in the soil of this larger story, which is a self-transcending universe. We could call it a reforming universe. That's how it works. That's what it does. And here's what I mean. Back to Jim's earlier revelation of this sort of ongoing creation that's always happening. There was never a time where the church was created or established, so to speak. I'll go back to that in a second. Because like this larger pattern, the deeper roots, self-transcending universe, means it's always moving beyond itself. It's always creating more. How many of you have heard just the sort of general idea that the universe is expanding? Yeah, right? Okay, so we sort of hear that and we accept it. Exactly. That's another way of saying self-transcending universe. But it's important to know that it's not just that it's getting bigger. And when it comes to the church, thank God for that. Because if the story's just about getting bigger, that actually could have turned out horrifically, right? Like what if we froze the frame in the Crusades and we're like, yeah, it seems pretty good. Let's just kill everybody that doesn't confess Christ as Lord. But let's take this global. Let's just make this bigger. No, the story isn't just bigger. We understand intuitively that at some level, self-transcendence means that we also at least ought to just hope that it's getting better, right? And the universe does this in some captivating ways. It's self-transcending in at least these ways. First of all, complexity. Atoms are more complex than particles. Molecules are more complex than atoms. Cells are more complex than molecules. You sort of see that progression. People are more complex than cells. And then obviously Game of Thrones is more complex than anything. Yes, I got a couple laughs. So for 13.8 billion years, this thing has been increasing in complexity. And so from another perspective, it's also been increasing in depth. Particles only have the depth of particles. How many of you are like, particles are so shallow, right? But atoms have the depth of atoms, and they also have the depth of particles. And then molecules have the depth of molecules and the depth of atoms and the depth of particles, like so on and so forth. It just keeps getting deeper and deeper the more complex it gets. So each unfolding layer in this emergent phenomenon adds another layer of depth as it unfolds. And not only depth and complexity, but the real energy is actually in the bonding. And I actually saw this when we were sitting in the room. Heather was sitting alone, and these two got up and moved over to sit with her so that she wasn't sitting alone. Not only complexity, not only depth, but unity, this bonding. When atoms bond with other bonds, you don't just get a bunch of atoms, you get something new, molecules, and it's got qualities and characteristics that didn't exist at the earlier component level. And not only the particular atomic molecular level, we actually see this in nature like we saw this in the room. Birds that fly together, you see them banking and swooping. No single bird is making the decision about which direction to fly, but when they fly together, a communal mind emerges. And if you took each bird one at a time out and tried to pinpoint which bird was making the decisions, you'd never find it. The communal mind only emerges when they bond together in flight. This has been called emergence, holism, epiphenomenon. Now this starts to get fascinating when we look at the move from cells to people, because you can dissect a person and you can account for all the cells that make them up. You can explain a bunch about the various systems that sustain their biological life, but you cannot, by looking at the earlier component levels of cells or even systems, you can't account for the new qualities that emerge in people, like consciousness, ethics, moral ambition, empathy, loneliness. You can't dissect a person and find that stuff. So at each unfolding layer, we get something new that can't be identified at the earlier component levels. And this happens in the bonding, right? So we call this unity, maybe. Particles bond with others of similar essence and substance to create something new, expanded, better, more complex. Or we might say it is in their uniting that they self-transcend. Or it's in the bonding that they move beyond themselves, right? If Dan and Katie were only about themselves and hadn't gotten up to come and sit with Heather, it would not have been about the experience the three of them are now sharing. It would have been about three distinct experiences, but now something new has emerged, which is their shared experience. How many of you ever said, I just want to be a part of something bigger than myself, right? Probably in college, maybe before, maybe after. So does everything else in the universe. Everything. We say it because we've had this moment of epiphany or revelation, but when we take seriously the roots of the story, we see that everything in the universe is animated by this impulse to bond, to self-transcend, to expand, to evolve, to participate in healthy relationships of energy. We all want to be a part of something bigger than ourselves. So expanding complexity, depth, and unity, this is the story. And then at the very last second of the story, as we know it, humans come on the scene and we become aware that we're aware. which has got to be a traumatic experience, we begin to experience self-reflection, wonder, curiosity, a quest for meaning, desire, this full range of emotions, what we might call consciousness. We've got the thought bubble. The ability to stand outside of ourselves and ponder and analyze the world and our life experience, probably a deep and complex feeling. How many of us have ever experienced that deep sort of existential, is this all there is? Might have had something to do with your job, a relationship you were in, right? And what we're saying, we ask that question, what we're saying is, I long for more. I could do better. I could be better. I could make a higher contribution. I could be happier. I could be less stressed. I could be more fulfilled. I could be a better parent. I could be a truer friend. Where did we get the idea that our life should be more than it is? Where did that come from? That we just think that it could be better? That that's even an option? Where did we come up with the idea that we deserve an explanation for our suffering? That things should be fair? That things should be just, that beauty is superior to destruction, that this should all mean something. Where did this come from? How many of you guys went to the ice cream walk Friday? We were serving a delicious, what was it called? The Dark Chocolate Night of the Soul. We were scooping, that was our collective ice cream. So even if you didn't go to the ice cream walk, how many of you stuck around downtown long enough to participate in the child sacrifice that we did after? Nobody? Just to keep the traditions alive. No, right? No, we don't do that. How many of you think slavery is wrong? Every hand up would be awesome. If we could get that, that would be, if we could get that response all the way, that would be, I don't want to tell you what to do, but this is one of those. And yet, people used to perform ritual child sacrifices as a part of religious observance, and it was totally normal. And people we know in their lifetime, slavery was a thing, right? In which a black man kneeling in protest of anything meant physical violence or death. That existed in some people's lifetime. So where did this come from? This ability to look back and these things that were once totally normal and acceptable and even celebrated, and we view them now as abhorrent, unethical, illegal, immoral. Where does a shift in consciousness at a personal, a communal, and a species level, where does that come from? By the way, there's this Hebrew word that Jesus uses all the time called repentance. This is to rethink, to think again. And it's not like, oh, I just heard something I've never heard, like a new little bit of information. It's not a new idea. It is a shift in consciousness. It's a shift in how you see everything. And how many of you this week, with race and football, or this year with the vitriol around partisan division and white supremacy, or in these past few years sort of feeling the regression of massive groups of people to hating and scapegoating and perpetrating violence against folks who are of a different sexuality or gender identity or race or class or nationality or education level, how many of us not only look back and say, thank God we don't sacrifice children anymore, but we also look forward and we say, but we still have a long way to go, right? After the couple of years that we've had, like, we're not killing kids anymore, bonus, and granted, they still are some places, but we still have a long way to go. I mean, isn't that what it means to kneel in protest? You're simply pairing an action with this deep feeling that things are not as they should be. They have to continue to be pushed further, and we should keep bringing this up until things get addressed. Where does that reflection and that hope come from? Now, even though we've only had less than a cosmic second to have this thought, this moral reflection, what you've just affirmed is some sort of a moral trajectory. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. says it like this: let us realize the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. We come from somewhere, we're headed somewhere, and there's some deep sense or awareness that it needs to be getting better. This was worse. This is a bit better. There's still a lot of potential for an even better up ahead. What is this? What do we call this pull, the energy, this force? How could we summarize the story? The French Jesuit paleontologist Pierre Teilhard de Chardin says progress is the soul of the universe. And so for him, the progress story and the soul story are the same story. Whatever this energy is that's moving things forward, this is the soul of the universe, the energy from which all life arises, with which all life is in relationship, and within which all life is expanding and increasing in complexity, depth, and unity. In the beginning, this energy, this soul, this progress, harbored in the name of God, which, by the way, was only ever spoken in the last millisecond of the cosmic day, something began creating, evolving, reforming. And the story is that it has never stopped. It's happening right now in this room. If the roots of the tradition are planted in this story, how could the story be anything other than reform? This universal, expansive nurturing of innovation, self-transcending progress. What's pulling this thing forward? What do we call this? Why does this work? Why does the universe have this fundamental drive to self-transcend? Have any of you ever been through a hurricane? Nailed it. If during our conversation that Sunday night after Hurricane Irma, we had this full house downstairs at the table, everyone's like, air conditioning, thank God. If we had said, wow, that was some hurricane, and some smart aleck dad joker, we'll call him Dave for the sake of the story, Dave, let's say Dave chimes up and goes, I didn't see any hurricane. And we're like, no, yeah, because the trees and the leaves, there's whipping wind and all the rain and the flooding, transformers blowing up, generators kicking on, debris flying, tornadoes whirling. And Dave goes, yeah, but you can't see air. You know, maybe you saw orange and yellow on the TV, but you can't actually see a hurricane. But like, we drove around after. Clearly a hurricane came through here. And we may go back and forth, debating whether or not you can literally see a hurricane, but you cannot deny the effects of a hurricane. That something happened. Something came through here. The effects are incontrovertible. What has come through here? What has come through here? Something has happened. If a hurricane is a pattern of air, what do we call this pattern of energy? What is the name of this story? And it's interesting. Some people, they say nothing's going on here, right? Carbon-based life forms. We're a collection of particles and atoms, molecules, happy accident, no larger narrative. It's just survival at its most primitive form, right? Good luck. And so this is us walking through the neighborhood with Dave afterwards. There's trees down and power lines sparking, the power's out and shingles and debris everywhere. And Dave's going, what hurricane? It's curious all this damage, but I don't know about a hurricane, right? Nothing happened here. And this is often called the open-minded perspective, right? But wouldn't the open-minded perspective be to simply look at this and leave room for whatever this is? I'm not saying we have to know with certainty what this is, but to leave room. For thousands of years, people have been naming this story. Some say it's a force, right? May it be with you. And also with you would be nice when I say that. Thank you. Some people say it's a spark or the engine of the universe or a spirit. One of my favorites, Jim Kane gave me this one a while back. It's called Lovely Developments, right? And it works. It works. There are even some, you may have read about these people in books, or maybe you saw a documentary, but they refer to this as God. And for some of you, that immediately, well, the word God is problematic. Right? You can't do the God thing, and that's okay, because maybe the word God is actually tied up in what feels like a step backwards, right? To say God is almost like a regression, like we're moving backwards in the story, and that's okay. It's a word, right? The word God is not this reality. The name does not contain this story. It's a word. And again, it's a word that was only spoken in the final millisecond of the cosmic story. The story is just fine without the word. But remember that if what you mean when you reject the word God is some other story, if it's a 6-line transactional narrative of superstition and magical thinking, most of us probably reject that God too. And I think part of what Reform invites us to do is to reimagine even God in light of the story of the soul of the universe. Because for some people, Reform means looking back and going, come on, man, we need to leave behind the magical thinking, the mumbo-jumbo. We need to step in the future because it's all about love, right? Love is the engine. Love is the spirit. Love is the energy. Love is the force. And so if we do that, we say, yeah, fine. Let's call this invisible hurricane of a story love. Something came through here, and it was love. And it makes sense. I mean, isn't love the experience of a growing relationship of energy that increases in complexity, depth, and unity, hopefully, if it's healthy? Something bigger than any one person can create alone, something greater than the sum of two parts. That's love. That's relationships of energy. By the way, thousands of years ago, writers of sacred texts were saying silly things like God is love. So not entirely a new idea. When it comes to reform, and we look back at the 6-line narrative and we say, that doesn't seem maybe like the best fit anymore. And like we said, right, it makes sense for people where they are. We can never do any better than our best. So for a lot of people, the 6-line narrative still makes sense. That's fine. Let them have it. But for some people, it's not a good fit anymore. The up-down, the problem-solution, that story made sense for a lot of people for a long time, but so did slavery. And so did child sacrifice. And so at some point, the call to reform is one that we have to hear. Is there a better way? Is there a more generous and expansive story that could hold it all together? And we need to be careful. This is something we talk about a lot. We need to be careful not to put this back in the binary categories and simply say, new story versus old story, right? What we want to not do is define against and reject the other story. We use this imagery for the series of like a tree and a sapling to communicate that if reform is rooted in the progress, which is the whole of the universe, rooted in a story of wholeness, not a transaction or a freeze frame, then it has to continue to be about expansion and not about rejection. It has to be about a growing wholeness, not a sharper binary. Our thing, their thing. What we know now, what they did wrong back then. We could say it like this. A seed's job is to survive. A tree's job is to thrive or to bear fruit. Because if you think about it, the seed story, if you freeze the frame, the seed story actually feels a lot like the Greco-Roman story, right? The seed falls from a tree of perfection into the soil down below of potential and peril. Life is hanging in the balance, and then it either grows back up into the light to bud and blossom and flourish and thrive in perfection, or down, tree or dirt, life or death. But taken in the larger story, the whole story of a tree, we realize that the seed is a moment. It's a season, one that may feel very binary, but it's actually a part of a much larger whole, the entire life of a tree. Or we could put it like this: when we hold the 6-line narrative in light of the cosmic narrative, the cosmic Christ rooted in this 13.8 billion-year-old story, the spirit, the life force that has mysteriously blown through this story, the God of wholeness who is one, in whom we live and move and be. When we hold the 6 lines in light of this cosmic story, it's not that we're throwing darts or we're sort of triumphantly saying, we reject this because now we've got the certain answer, and how silly that old story was, and our story is the right one, and our story now is the one that'll really satisfy us. No, that's just a different version of that same story. What we're saying with humility is that whatever the story is, it's bigger. It's bigger than 6 lines. It's bigger than we can understand. It's more expansive. It's moving forward, not backward, and we want to be along for the ride. We want to somehow choose to step into that. Think about this. Trees don't define against. Trees don't look back at the days of being a seed and say how stupid and ignorant those seeds were, how small and feeble, how shallow and unaware. Right? Molecules don't judge atoms. They expand. Right? The tree is not anti-seed. It is pro-tree. Trees don't sit around and talk shit about the stupid seeds. Right? They grow. They become trees. That's what they do. And this means the story of wholeness, the cosmic story, must transcend and include. Like the universe A tree, or in this case, religious faith, a spiritual movement, emerges from that which came before it. And so the story is always evolving in ways that reflect on where we've come from. They take a sober look at where we are, and they continue to listen for the call that pulls us forward. So when we talk about the roots of the tradition in light of this cosmic story, we're not actually trying to identify any particular roots or even any particular soil like a belief or a creed or an orthodoxy. What we're saying is that the tradition at its deepest level is rooted in this movement. It's most deeply committed to naming and participating in the sacred expansion of life and flourishing and bearing fruit and being formed, complexity, depth, unity. And not surprisingly, Jesus teaches this way, right? If you look at the patterns of his teaching, you've heard it said, but I say. Just sort of a way of saying it's more complex than that. You've heard it said, but I say. It's more complex than that. Or he says, here's a parable. Don't look for the simple meaning because it's deeper than that. It's more complex than that. It's deeper than that. My prayer is that all people would be one, as God and I are one. Love your neighbor, love your enemy, and the new command is to love one another. What does Jesus teach? Complexity, depth, unity, right relationships of energy among people. And his reform is around these very same things, right? When Jesus celebrates the Seder meal with his friends, he doesn't say, screw the Seder meal, screw the Jewish faith, I have a new idea. We're going to do something totally different. He doesn't reject it. He opens it. He doesn't say, this is bad, we need to do the good thing. He takes what is. He says a once-a-year ritual can actually be an everyday meal, as often as you do this, open to everyone. Same simple things, eating and drinking. He's not anti-Seder. He's pro-inclusive meal, a table that invites everybody. And this is a reminder that sometimes, even if reform isn't rebellion, and even if we're not defining against, and even if we're not rejecting and picking fights with what came before, reform can cost us. Reform can be dangerous. But at the end of the day, telling this story is a reminder this is where the universe is headed. This is where life and all things are moving. What might our lives and our spiritual practice look like if each time, as often as we ate and drank, we remembered this story that we find ourselves in? Would we find ourselves just a little bit humbled, as so many of you have said, by how little we are and by how little we really know? What if we brought that humility with us to the table when we ate and drank? Would we find ourselves open to complexity and depth and unity, this ever-expanding force of love and progress that are harbored in the name of God? Would it find us grateful for that bread and cup, like our bodies and our blood, like the planet that we're standing on, like the solar system and the universe, and maybe the multiverse, that we're all made of the same dust? We come from that same point. And as the tradition says, it's to that dust that we'll return. Would it make us more aware than ever that our most important contributions in this life, our events, our moments, they're relationships of energy, and that we get to choose to participate in something so much bigger than ourselves? The table of this particular bread like a body broken, and of this particular cup, like bloodshed. If we let them, they can open the door to the story, to the soul of the universe. The particular can allow us to step into the universal, the soul that is alive in each of us, in each breath, in each bite, in each of these interactions. This is the table. This is the table. This is the story of the table that is set for us tonight. As always, this is open to us, but it's open to all people, ever expanding, and no one will ever be turned away. When you're ready, feel free to come and grab a piece of bread and dip it in the cup.